I'd like to ask about the veil of ignorance. That is the original position that Rawls devised. I know that Thomas Hobbes defined it as a state of nature, and Rousseau sort of defined it as a much more Edenic place. But what is Rawls' original position? I'd like you to elaborate on that, the veil of ignorance, so to speak.
Yes. So the aim in the book, A Theory of Justice, is to propose, to explain, to justify principles of justice, standards that Rawls thought reasonable people could agree on as the highest level principles to guide their cooperation in a democratic society. And he has two principles of justice, and we can talk more later on about the principles. But very roughly speaking, there's a principle of equal basic liberties, and then a principle that requires a certain kind of equal opportunity and that restricts the extent of inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth. So he explains those principles and their implications, but then the large question in A Theory of Justice is, why these principles? What's the justification for them? What are the reasons for them? And the way he justifies them is that he revives, and it was a revival, the idea of a social compact or social contract that, as you say, you find in the tradition of political philosophy, including in Hobbes and in John Locke and in Jean-Jacques Rousseau and in Kant as well. Though the idea of a social contract or social compact as a justification for a certain type of political society had fallen out of favor. So Rawls, as I say, revives it, I think particularly influenced by Rousseau, a reading of Rousseau. And so the idea is to justify the principles by arguing that these principles, these standards of justice, the ones that I mentioned, would be agreed to by people in a situation that's designed for the purpose of assessing principles of justice. Now, it's a complicated setup, what that situation is, where you make the social contract, but a key idea is the idea, as you said, of the veil of ignorance. So you make it in what he calls the original position, that's the contract situation. And a key defining feature of the original position is this idea of a veil of ignorance. And a veil of ignorance is that you're supposed to reason about what the requirements of justice are on the assumption that you don't know all kinds of things about yourself. You don't know whether you're rich or poor. You don't know whether you're a man or a woman. You don't know if you have religious convictions or what those religious convictions are. You don't know what your fundamental values are. So you put all of those features behind the veil of ignorance, meaning you reason without any reference to them as if you didn't know them. And the idea, to put it more positively, the idea is that all you know about yourself and all that the other participants know about themselves is fundamentally that they are free and equal moral persons. So it's a way of justifying principles of justice that emphasizes certain fundamental, morally salient commonalities among people and puts the differences between and among people to the side, puts them to the side specifically for the purpose of working out what the right principles of justice are. Of course, those differentiating features of your identity or my identity are as I said, religious tradition or social position or gender or race. Those may be very, very important to us in making decisions about how we're going to conduct, how I or you or some person is going to conduct their life. But this is about how we are going to conduct our common life. And for the purposes of that, Rawls thinks that the salient feature is that we share these qualities of being free and equal moral persons and not those differences between and among us. That's the sort of main idea of the original position.
Gotcha. So another one of Rawls's ideas, if I get it correctly, is that he accepts that because of political liberty and economic liberty, some people are going to end up richer than others, perhaps vastly so. But he conceded that, but he theorizes, or he proposes, that any and all inequalities must be made somehow to benefit the poorest amongst us. Yeah. And of course, it runs into the libertarians have proposed a critique of it, which is something that I have subscribed to, because usually economic libertarians would say that, well, economic inequality and a society in which people are economically unequal, as in someone is making more even vastly more money than someone else, does not make it necessarily unjust. And any and all attempt to sort of like equalize the income distribution would end up, giving the state more power. I've recently finished Thomas Sowell's book, The Quest for Cosmic Justice, in which he put Rawls's ideas to a critical lens. And I remember one of his quotes as saying, well, if Rawls is correct, then imagine a policy that benefits millions of people in the middle class. But that policy, while beneficial, remains unjust because it doesn't benefit the poorest amongst us. So how would Rawls or you respond to that?
Yeah. So the wonderful question. I mentioned before that Rawls has these two principles of justice. There's an equal basic liberty principle, and then there's this principle about opportunity and distributive fairness. And the principle about distributive fairness, which he called the difference principle, says that inequality are permissible from the point of justice, from the point of view of justice, if and only if they contribute maximally to the benefit of the least advantaged. And by least, there's a complicated story here about what he means by least advantage, but a way to think about it operationally speaking is he's thinking of the least advantaged social group as, say, the group that's at the bottom quintile of the income distribution, say the bottom 20% of the income distribution. So the thought behind the veil, if you're choosing principles behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, you don't know whether you're going to be, whether you're rich or poor. You regard yourself as a free and equal member of the society. And what you are concerned about is making sure that your situation is going to be, roughly speaking, as good as it can be, no matter where you end up. So you could end up at the top, you could end up at the bottom. You're particularly concerned in the original position behind the veil of ignorance of making sure that if you end up in that least advantaged group, say the bottom quintile in the income distribution, your situation is still pretty good, meaning that you want some liberties, of political liberty and religious liberty, et cetera, and you also want a share of resources of economic resources, of income and wealth, that enables you to make something of those liberties, to make something of your life. So Rawls talks about the worth of liberty, and the worth of liberty is the value of the liberties to you. And the value of the liberties to you depends on what you're able to do with them, and that depends on the resources that you have at your disposal. And so the way Rawls describes this is, if you put these principles together, the liberty principle and then the difference principle, what they do together is, they say that what you're trying to do is to maximize the worth of liberty to the least advantaged group. Now, so you do have, from the point of view of justice, a singular focus on that least advantaged group. You're not focused on the most advantaged group. Well, they're already the most advantaged. And you're not trying, as is often said in American politics, you're not trying to maximize for the middle class, which is where Thomas Sowell's point comes into play. And I think the way Rawls was thinking about this was, suppose there's some policy, some tax policy and some rules of the economic game, and if you make that policy, you can do really, really well for the middle class, but there's no gain for people who are in the least advantaged position. How is that possible? Why is it that I need to understand, not just as an abstract theoretical possibility, but as a real social possibility, how could it be that there's no way that people who are in the least advantaged position, the least advantaged in a society of equals, people who are equally important, whose lives matter equally, and they're the most disadvantaged, and there's no way of trying to ensure that they do better, that for some reason, I don't know how it's possible even, all of the advantage has to go to the middle class. Well, I don't get how that's possible. And then the thought is that if you can ensure distribution in which the least advantaged do better, those are the members of the society of equals who who aren't getting the attention that they're entitled to. The worth of their liberty, what they're able to do with their lives, is the least among us, and less than it could be if we did things a little differently.